This is Covering the Spread. Here are your hosts, Jim Saunders and Dr. Ed Feng.
What is going on, everybody? Welcome on into Covering the Spread. That is right here on the FanDuel Podcast Network and NumberFire.com, as we're taking a look ahead to Week 5 of the 2019 NFL season and letting you know our favorite bets on the board with Zachariason of NumberFire and FanDuel. My name is Jim Saunders. I am a senior writer and analyst for NumberFire.com, joined here as always by Ed Feng of the PowerRank.com. Ed, we are on to week number 5 in the NFL. How you doing today?
I'm doing great, man. It's that time of year where the air gets a little less humid, gets a little crisp as we get into October, and we start figuring out who the contenders and the pretenders are. So it's an exciting time.
We were putting out our Halloween decorations last night, which I think is like, I like putting out Christmas decorations because there's a lot more, but the Halloween decorations, like, they remind me of fall. I get to wear sweaters. I get to wear, like warm socks. I get to eat candy corn. I get to have apple cider and not feel guilty about it. Like, it's my time of year. This is my time where I feel good. I feel great.
Excellent. Yeah, so do I. I definitely like it when it gets a little cooler. A little more fun to be outside and sweat a little bit. So, yeah.
Do you still run outside when it's like in the 50s or so?
I mean, I run outside when it's in the single digits.
Oh, man.
So I kind of... It's actually nice in the Midwest in the winter because no one else is outside. You got the whole place to yourself.
That is fair. I will, I'll leave that.
You want to go out? I know you're up there in Syracuse, New York. You get a little bit of...
I like going out, but I don't like running. I would not run outdoors. I will flop around in a snow pile, but I'm not going to go running. So I'll leave that to you, Ed.
Running keeps you warm.
That's a valid point. You make good points, and I'm saying that your argument is logical, but I'm not going to do it. There's a big disconnect there for sure. You can find Ed on Twitter at the Power Rank. I am at Jim Saunders, JimSannes. Coming up today, we're going to talk with Zachariason, the editor-in-chief over at FanDuel and at NumberFire. You can find him on Twitter at LateRoundQB. We're going to break down Week 5 of the NFL and talk about how JJ changes player outlooks during the season to account for role changes. We're going to talk about 3 of the biggest games on this Week 5 slate and get his thoughts on the totals and spreads in those games. We also had our college football preview earlier this week with Eli Hershkovich of You Better You Bet. Breaking down Week 6 of college football, we gave some breakdowns on Iowa, Michigan State versus Ohio State, Auburn, Florida. Eli talked about Illinois versus Minnesota as well. And if you want to find that podcast, just search for Covering the Spread on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, the Google Play Store, iHeartRadio. Wherever you get your podcasts, you can find Covering the Spread and get Eli's thoughts there. While you're there, make sure you subscribe, rate, and review the podcast. All those help us out a ton. We really do appreciate it. Before we bring on JJ, though, got to take a look back at last week and go through our NFL picks here, and our guest, Whale Capper, had a pretty solid week.
Covering the past.
All right, so in the Week 4 preview of Covering the Spread, we had Whale Capper on, and he did really well. He won the Browns +7 in that game against Baltimore, and the Browns played really well, won that game outright. He also wanted the under for Patriots-Bills at 43.5, and that game was a super low-scoring affair, and it wasn't just because Josh Allen left. It was a low-scoring game even before that, so he got that one there. Also wanted the under for Saints at Cowboys at 47. That game was way under as well. Did have the Chiefs -6.5, and that game was tight the whole way. The Chiefs did come back to win, but the Lions did cover. But overall, really nice week there for Whale Capper, going 3-1 there. Ed, you and I didn't do as hot. I had the Texans.
Saying, Whale didn't even have to sweat 3 of those games, right? So,
no, there was no. I think the Browns +7, they won by like 12, covered there by like 19. Patriots-Bills went under by almost 20 points, and Cowboys-Saints went under by 25 points.
That was there wasn't much going on in that game.
Yeah, so find Whale Capper on Twitter at Whale_Capper because he deserves your follow. I was bad because I wanted the over on the Texans-Panthers. That game went way under. Kyle Allen fumbled like 17 times. Deshaun Watson didn't have his best game. That was a bad pick on my part. Ed talked about the Vikings +2.5 against the Bears. And the Bears won that one. Mitch Trubisky got hurt. It was a very strange game. There were fumbles in that game, too. It was a weird week. And I think that was one of the weirder games on there. And now Stephon Diggs is just MIA.
Yeah, I mean the line movement was great because I think I think we talked about it, Minnesota +3 or +2.5. It ended up being a pick by game time.
Right.
Trubisky goes down. What's his name? Chase Daniel comes in and it was pretty good. I don't know how long that's going to last. But I wanted to say that we got to start reevaluating this Minnesota team as like a sleeper Super Bowl team because that's not looking so hot right now. It's definitely something I talked about in the preseason. I thought a guy named Kirk Cousins could get his act together and be the $175 million guy that he was signed as. So far hasn't gotten it done. And the defense doesn't really look great either by some of my success rate numbers too. So I am in the process of reevaluating what I thought about that team.
Well, one thing we talked about with Minnesota was that we didn't think they would go as extreme as this when it comes to running the football because they had Kirk Cousins, they had Adam Thielen, they had Stephon Diggs. When you have personnel like that, you're probably not going to go as extreme as they have gone. But for whatever reason, they have taken it as far as you possibly can. And we've seen Kirk Cousins be not a great quarterback, but he's been a very competent quarterback in years past. And suddenly, despite having good personnel around him, that's not there. So I think the thought process behind liking the Vikings, and a large part of it was the Vikings were 30-1 to win the Super Bowl. That was a very good number, I thought. I think that the thought process behind it was still not bad. It's just that they went to the polar, they went as far as they could in the negative direction, I think.
Right. Well, I mean, they are running the ball well.
Right.
So, I mean, there is that, but yeah, I mean, I agree. I think the thought process was right. I think a lot of people kind of agreed with that, but it's time to reevaluate. It's October.
Absolutely. And that's something we can do. We've got data. We can change our minds. We should change our minds. Once we get more data and get better information, we should change our minds. And it's looking like it's that time for Minnesota. We're going to bring JJ in just 1 second. But first, if you want to get in on the action, check out the FanDuel Sportsbook and place your first bet today. If you lose, FanDuel will give you a refund of up to $500 in site credit. Visit sportsbook.fanduel.com for more details. Terms and conditions apply. Must be 21 plus and physically present in New Jersey or Pennsylvania. Gambling problem? Call 1-800-GAMBLER. Let's bring on JJ Zachariason now to preview week number 5 of NFL. Once again, follow him on Twitter at LayRoundQB.
Covering the present.
Let's bring on JJ Zachariason now to preview week 5 across the NFL. JJ, welcome back to Covering the Spread. How you doing today?
I'm good, man. I'm good. I'm ready for week 5 to get going.
And it's already week 5, which feels like insanely weird to me. Like we're already into October. It feels like we were doing preseason podcasts, talking about player projections with you like 5 minutes ago. So like, I have no idea where the season has gone so far.
Yeah, it's nuts.
Yeah, so let's break down week 5 here with JJ. And JJ, when we had you on back in July, actually, for our first show, we were talking about, player projections, talking about player props and stuff like that. And now that we actually have some data, we've got thoughts on what guys' roles may be, but those roles also change from one week to the next. Like David Montgomery in week 1 didn't have a big role, but that has steadily increased as the year has gone along. And obviously, those role changes are going to play a pretty major role in prop betting. So how do you account for role changes when you're trying to project what a player will do in the coming week?
Yeah, so I think that there's probably 3 main buckets to sort of look at here. The first one is sort of the news that beat writers are saying. I know that you sort of have to sift through that and see what matters and what doesn't matter, and that's not always an easy thing to do, but I still think that information is helpful in some way. You can look at peripheral numbers as well. Peripheral numbers meaning numbers that aren't really being shown on their end of game stat line. But if you're looking at things like snap rate, and if you see that increasing, but the numbers don't match with their end of game stat line, then you know that better numbers are coming. But even still, a good example of this, even if a player isn't seeing that many snaps, a good example of this is his usage when he is on the field. You can look at that 2 ways. You can look at it as that player is going to regress and he's not going to see such high usage on the minimal snaps that he played. Or you could see it as they want to give this guy the ball. He's only played 25% of the team's snaps, but maybe if he sees more snaps, then all of a sudden he's going to see the ball more, or, they're giving him the ball for a reason, if you will. So I think those are two things. Then you could just look at general talent and how well these guys are playing. I mean, there's a lot of statistics out there. And even if you're just watching film, you can see that Ronald Jones looks really good in the Tampa Bay backfield. And I think that we can confidently say that Ronald Jones at least deserves to see more work in that backfield. Now, we're also working with the assumption of rational coaching, which isn't always the case. But, at the same time, more often than not, coaches are rational. And as a result of that, you can utilize that for player prop purposes.
So how do you weigh those two things? Because let's stick with the Ronald Jones one as an example here, because we've seen Jones perform pretty well, I think, the entire year, and they've kind of had this hot hand approach. Bruce Arians still says that he wants Nick Payton-Barber in there. So how much do you weigh player evaluation and what you think should happen versus what coaches are saying and things like that?
Yeah, I mean, you obviously have to take a leap of faith if you're going to go really hard in a particular prop where you're having faith that this is going to be the week that they end up throwing this guy under center a little bit more. So I think that it's risky. It's riskier. I think that, overall, if you just look at, if you combine those two things, and if you look at Ronald Jones's increasing snap share, for instance, and you see it getting better and better each week. David Montgomery, another good example, where week one his snap share didn't look great. His running back usage out of that backfield from a snap or from a production share standpoint didn't look great. But then you see that increasing week over week over week. You can feel more confident that sort of trend is going to continue into the coming week. So I think it's just kind of combining all of those things.
Excellent. So JJ, a lot of your work centers around regression. When we had you on in the preseason, you did told us about a lot of nice things with regression to the mean in terms of touchdown rate and other things that are going to regress pretty hard from season to season. How can we apply that to the current season? Where we've only had 4 weeks of the season, regression is going to hit pretty hard. Who are you trying to monitor the next couple of weeks?
Yeah, so an easy way to look at touchdown regression, actually, in particular, and obviously that can play into player props as well, but an easy way to look at touchdown regression is to see how many yards a player has versus how many touchdowns he scored, and see how frequently players score based on those yardage totals over the last decade, however long back you want to go. And the main reason you can do that is because the two correlate pretty strongly together. Obviously a player who's seeing more yards is likely to score more touchdowns. And if there's, if you're looking at that and you see a player with a really high yardage total, like Leonard Fournette, who hasn't found the end zone yet, you can spot regression and say this guy has positive regression heading his way. I mean, if you look at Fournette in particular, based on his yardage total, and this is both receiving and rushing, he should have about 3.5 touchdowns this year. But he hasn't scored at all. And obviously this is all situation dependent. Someone like Todd Gurley of last year, for instance, is always going to outperform in this particular metric in the way that we're doing things here, but it at least gives you a high level view as to how players should be performing versus how they are performing in the touchdown column. And we know that touchdowns are a little bit fickle, and it's a way to sort of play that market and see where things are at from a prop bet standpoint, because we know that, Leonard Fournette, seeing this usage that he's seeing, which is really only being seen by like Christian McCaffrey to start the year and Le'Veon Bell, eventually he's going to find the end zone regardless of the offense that he's in. So you can utilize that to your advantage and realize that regression is going to hit as long as he continues that production.
Yeah, the thing with Leonard Fournette, too, that's helpful is that they don't have anyone else to put in to, take away a goal line carry, which I think can make you even more confident about those yardage numbers, too.
Yeah, and the other thing, too, that I think is really important and often overlooked is a team-level regression. A lot of people just look at the individual Leonard Fournette and say he should have more touchdowns, sure. But I like looking at the way teams are scoring touchdowns. And by that, I mean, what's their pass-to-rush touchdown ratio? So if you look at 3 teams this year, the Falcons, the Jags, and the Lions, all 3 of those teams have 8 or more passing touchdowns and 1 or fewer rushing touchdowns. So not only does that mean that we're probably going to see some sort of regression hit where that evens out a little bit more, but then you can kind of carry that over to what happens with the quarterbacks and what happens with the running backs on those teams, and then utilize that information for player props.
Interesting. So that'll be applicable for the Lions next week, potentially, when Kerryon Johnson comes off a bye. So interesting guys to monitor there for sure from a prop betting perspective. But let's dive in to three pretty big games on tap for week number 5, starting off down in the Superdome, where the Buccaneers are squaring off with the Saints. A lot more interesting than this game appeared like it would be a couple weeks ago when Drew Brees went down. The Saints are 3-point favorites here. The total is 46.5, and the Bucs got a huge win last week on the road against the Rams. Do you view this Buccaneers team as being legit, JJ? They've been kind of close in every game so far. Or will that game look like an outlier against the Rams by season's end?
Yeah, it's really interesting. I think that, entering the season, we could have looked at this Buccaneers roster from a personnel standpoint and say that they were a bottom 10 roster in the league. But I think that we're seeing what the impact of coaching can have in the league, especially on the defensive side. Todd Bowles is really doing good work with that defense. But it's sort of hard to get a read on them because losing to the Giants at home makes me think that they're kind of not for real. They're kind of in this weird limbo stage where they're probably the toughest team to read, but at the same time, I do think that we can feel a little bit confident about Tampa Bay, just given the coaching staff and the changes there and how that has looked so far.
The other thing too is we're always going to have games during the year where we look back and we're like, what on earth happened? Why was that game, how is this game such an anomaly? And I think that Rams game, there was a lot of weird stuff that went down. There were a lot of weird turnovers or a couple of defensive touchdowns. And I think it's hard to put a lot of stock in what we saw there. And you could say the same thing about the Saints in the first game with Teddy Bridgewater, where they had a couple of defensive or special teams touchdowns against Seattle, but then had an interesting game plan again against Dallas. So any thoughts on this game, JJ, whether it be the total, the spread, or just the Saints in general?
I think the total is a little bit too high. We saw New Orleans play it pretty conservatively, really both weeks. The main reason why you might not think the way that they played it conservatively 2 weeks ago against Seattle was that the defense played well and the rest of the unit played well. They were able to play from ahead. And that's not likely to happen week in and week out the way they started that game. Teddy Bridgewater throwing it deep on only 6.9% of his passes. That's by far the lowest in the NFL to start the season. I just don't love that. And on top of that, you have a game in New Orleans where they play better defensively. And as a result, you have the defense that'll play better, lower scoring contests in general. So I could easily see this going under. I know that there's been some line movement focusing on the under there, and I think it makes sense.
Excellent. So we got another big game with Green Bay going to Dallas. Dallas is a 3.5-point favorite. Green Bay couldn't get it done on Thursday night, but actually the offense probably had their best game of the year. This total is sitting at 47, and the Cowboys struggled last week. What do you see in this game and your analysis on both of these teams?
Yeah, so if you look at the Cowboys in particular, what we saw last week was that they're reverting back to more of this early down, run-heavy offense, which is not what we want to see. We want more points. We want them to air it out. That's when we see more offensive points for these teams. And Cowboys stats on Twitter, he said that they tweeted that they have a 39% success rate when handing it to Zeke on first down this year. Oh. It's a 53% success rate when Dak is throwing it. So I do have some concern over the play calling as a result. And look, the Packers defense has looked good this season, but you also have to look at who they've faced and where they've been. They've played a lot of games at home this year, and they've faced Chicago. Really, the only contest where they didn't look that great was last week when they finally played a pretty competent offense in Philadelphia. So overall, I think that just given the fact that given the fact that the Cowboys are running the offense the way that they're running it, there's some ambiguity as to how this Green Bay Packers defense might look. But one of the things with this Packers defense is that they've been really bad against the run, and that might force the Cowboys or make the Cowboys want to run the ball a little bit more in this contest. And if that's the case, it would speed up the game, not from a play calling standpoint, but literally a time standpoint. And that could cause lower scoring in this contest. So the under might end up hitting, especially without Devontae Adams.
Yeah, we've seen some line movement here too. It was 47, it's now 46.5. So backing up your point there, JJ. And you mentioned Devontae Adams probably going to miss this game. Tyron Smith also out for the Cowboys. So impactful offensive injuries on both sides, which I think again goes towards the under here. Do you think the Packers can cover this spread, or is it more about the under for you here?
I think it's more about the under. I might take the Cowboys just because of what I mentioned about the Packers defense and the fact that sure, this game might end up being slower paced because they can run the football on Green Bay, and that's not necessarily a great thing. It might keep the game closer. But at the same time, Green Bay has had really advantageous matchups defensively with their road game being in Chicago. And anytime you get a defense at home, they're going to play better. So that's really my fear with Green Bay here. And then on top of that, you have no Devontae Adams more than likely. So that just makes it easier to side with the Cowboys if you were going to side one way or the other.
All right, let's move on here to the Colts at the Chiefs. The spread in this one is the Chiefs -11. Total here has come down. It was 57, is now 56. And as of this recording, JJ, we don't know T.Y. Hilton's status for this game. I believe he sat out practice both Wednesday and Thursday. How much does T.Y. Hilton's availability influence your view of this Colts team here against Kansas City?
I mean, I would like the Colts offense more if T.Y. Hilton were active, but I also think it's easy to overstate what T.Y. Hilton would end up doing to this line and this total. I just am not feeling the Colts offense, at least from the perspective of how they've performed and how they should be performing. Jacoby Brissett so far this season has a 7.4% touchdown rate, which is third highest in the league behind only Mason Rudolph and Lamar Jackson. That's a really high touchdown rate for a backup quarterback who, I get it, not a typical backup quarterback. He's better than average, but I don't know if he's a better than average starter in the league. I don't think we can confidently say that. And that's a far too high touchdown rate for a player of that caliber. And then on top of that, the Colts are scoring a touchdown at the highest rate or the fifth highest rate in the league per drive. So that's another reason that we could look at this team and this offense and say they're bound to regress. Will that happen this week? Maybe not, because the Chiefs defense is that bad and that they have that many holes, but the fact that it's in Kansas City, that's why I think that it could hit this week. So I'm not really that optimistic about this Colts offense, even though they're going into Kansas City and playing a pretty mediocre Chiefs D.
Excellent. Well, what about the Chiefs against the Colts defense?
I mean, they should be able to do what they want for the most part because they can do that against any defense. But the Colts defense usually schemes pretty well. And we saw some of that, at least some of it, parts of the game in the playoffs last season. So I'm not, I think overall, I'm not looking at this game and feeling confident that the over is going to hit. I'm more confident at the under more than likely. But I think that, overall, a lot of that has to do with me believing that the Colts offense isn't going to be able to move the ball as well as they have so far this year. And then as a result of that, the Chiefs might just end up being a little bit more conservative.
Is the pessimism around the Colts offense enough to get you to bet the spread of KC -11, or is that number appropriate in your eyes?
I think it's pretty appropriate. I always get scared off anytime you see a double-digit spread in the NFL. It's just it's tough. Especially with a team in the Colts that's well coached and it's not, the personnel is not bad. So it's hard to bet a number like that. I think the number that you want to bet here is the total and just go the under.
All right. Any other spreads or totals you see on the board that you like here for week number 5 over at FanDuel Sportsbook?
Yeah, I'm really intrigued by the Cardinals-Bengals game. It could go in a lot of different directions, just because we know the offensive lines for both of those teams are very, very bad. So it wouldn't shock me at all if we see like a 13-10 game after everyone's super excited about what could happen in fantasy and this hitting the over. But I still think the over is still a decent bet, mostly because these two teams have run at a really fast pace to start the year. Arizona's first in the league in seconds per play. Cincinnati ranks 7th. They're both in top 10 situation neutral pace. So a higher pace means more plays. More plays means more points. And then that would hopefully result in the over being hit.
Yeah. And I think that's kind of the way you want to view it. You want to go for fast-paced games where the clock will stop often, and given Kyler Murray's success recently, the clock will stop pretty often there, and given Andy Dalton's lack of success, same thing. So I think that the thought process definitely there for sure. That is JJ Zachariason again. He is the editor-in-chief at both FanDuel and at Numberfire. You can follow him on Twitter at LateRoundQB. JJ, thank you for stopping by once again, talking a little regression, talking a little Week 5. We appreciate it. Good luck in Week 5, and we'll talk to you again soon.
Thanks, guys. Appreciate it.
Covering the future.
One final big thank you to JJ Zachariason for swinging by and breaking down week number 5 of the NFL. And we talk a lot about spreads and totals here on the show. We don't talk as much about player props, and most of that is because player props are not always posted by the time we record on Thursday,
Right.
so it's kind of hard to give a lot of analysis there. But
Right.
It's a really fun market, and I love player props from a betting perspective. It's just hard to do from an analysis perspective, but from an actual betting perspective, I think there's a lot of edge there, but they're also just really fun to follow.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think a lot of professional seasoned bettors will tell you if you're trying to get started, start with some player props. And I think we're seeing those more, and that's probably some pretty good advice.
And it's also a huge overlap between my research for daily fantasy and player props. So
Right.
it makes sense. From a strength perspective, I should skew towards player props. And glad to get JJ's thoughts on rule changes there. Ed and I always preach searching for the best value in betting on games. Well, look no further than the new odds comparison our engineers have developed over at numberfire.com. OddsFire is the premier odds comparison experience across major bookmakers in the regulated U.S. market. Compare odds, quickly identify the best value, and even examine first-party FanDuel data all in one place. Never settle, always get the best odds. Check out the experience for free now on Numberfire or at oddsfire.com. Gambling problem? Call 1-800-GAMBLER. Let's dive in now to covering the future, starting off with you, Ed, and you're looking at that Monday Night Football game between the 49ers and the Browns. And the Browns looked really good last week, but you want to focus on the 49ers and some really interesting numbers you've seen from them through the first couple of weeks.
Yeah, I think San Francisco is really interesting. I mean, we came into them this preseason, and I thought they were kind of getting overlooked. That actually doesn't turn out to be the case. I was looking at their win total both last year and this year with a healthy Jimmy Garoppolo each time. Last year, they're at 8.5 wins, shading the under. This year, they're at 8, shading the over. It's pretty much the same price. And so the market was essentially saying that this is a pretty average NFL football team. But they've been really good. I'm looking at success rate, which I define as half the necessary yards on first down, 70% of the necessary yards on second down, and all on third and fourth down. I adjust this for strength of schedule with the algorithms that I have, and on offense, they've been really good. They've been fourth with pretty even balance, fifth passing the ball, and second running the ball. It's been interesting. When you look at the PFF grades, a bunch of the top players on offense are their running backs. Which suggests that it's not necessarily the line, it's the play of some of the running backs. So they've been really good on that side of the ball. And also on defense, overall, their adjusted success rate is third, and they're really excelling in pass defense. They're first in adjusted success rate. Not so good in running the ball, 27th. Suggests some problems with the interior of the line. But the pass defense has been really good. Unit led by Richard Sherman back there. Some of Ahkello Witherspoon has actually gotten some really great grades. He's actually hurt right now, which is probably going to hurt them over the next couple of weeks. So the San Francisco 49ers, I mean, I don't expect them to be fourth and third on offense and defense by the end of the season necessarily. You're going to expect some regression, maybe some injuries. But this is certainly a team I'm looking for to find some value over the next couple of weeks, especially on the side. My numbers, which include all these success rate numbers, make them about a 3.3 point favorite. So suggest that the line at 3.5 is pretty fair this week. I would lean towards San Francisco just because they're coming off a bye week, and
Sure.
Cleveland's coming off a pretty emotional divisional game where they beat Baltimore. So maybe a little bit of a lean towards San Francisco. But heading into the future, these Niners are a team I'm looking to back.
And I think it's important to know when early season success is legit, because the 49ers have won a lot of games. They did really well heading into their bye week, and sometimes we may be looking at them as a spot for regression. But I think it's helpful to know that your numbers say, no, this is pretty legit. I think that with Kyle Shanahan, it's not surprising because he is a great schemer. And we talk about how rushing is less efficient a lot of the time. But with Shanahan, I think that's less so just because he doesn't do inefficient rushes. If you look back at last year, I think it was 3 of the top 5 teams as far as not running up the gut, because running up the gut from a success rate perspective, from an expected points perspective, is more inefficient than outside runs. The 49ers, I believe, had the lowest run up the middle percentage, and other teams that were near the top were Washington and Atlanta, both places Kyle Shanahan has coached very recently. So I think that he kind of leaves an imprint where he is, he does run. He does skew towards run a bit, and the 49ers offense so far this year has been a little bit more run heavy, but they run in a smart way. I think that's probably the right way to phrase it, is they don't run stupid. Like last year with the Cardinals, David Johnson up the gut never worked, but the 49ers don't do that. They run in a smart way, and I think that does matter too.
Yeah, and I think it's important to not run into 8-man boxes, right? I mean, that's why we always talk about pass rate on first down when, the typical NFL defense is going to put a lot of guys down in the box to stop the run. So, that just all the more reason to think about backing this team in the coming weeks.
I couldn't do it this week because I can't bet against my guy Baker. But going forward,
he's your guy. You believe in Baker?
I have a lot. Oh yeah. Okay, so I do a lot of research into the stickiness of college metrics for quarterbacks and how well that projects to the next level. And Baker was he checked every box because he had gobs of collegiate experience, which is something that has been good for quarterbacks as they transition to the NFL. He was hyper efficient in college. And when you combine those two things, quarterbacks don't fail very often. That's kind of why I've been so disgruntled with Marcus Mariota's lack of success in the NFL, is because he also checked both those boxes. Hasn't done a whole lot. It's why I'm hyper defensive of Jared Goff, because he wasn't the best college prospect, but people ragged on him, I thought, unnecessarily for a lot of reasons. So Baker's kind of been the major success story out of it. Pat Mahomes actually checked a lot more boxes than people may have thought as well, because he was actually pretty efficient in college too and played a good amount. Yeah. So I believe in Baker a lot, and that's why I want Freddie Kitchens to keep doing what he did last week and stop being a dingus like he was back in week 3.
Well, yeah, and I think, we all saw especially the Rams game where, when he got the ball out quickly, he got it there accurately. They were breaking off some big plays. Right. When he goes to his first, second read and just kind of pulls it down and starts bumbling around the pocket, that is not a good thing. And you're essentially seeing the exact same behavior from Shea Patterson of Michigan. Right. And a lot of people in Ann Arbor are down on Patterson. And I'm trying to tell people, look, this is like Baker Mayfield, right? It's the same, and I wouldn't necessarily have given up on Baker Mayfield. Right. So let's not quite give up. Let's have a little bit of confidence. Well, I mean, we'll see where it goes.
Right. The other thing, too, is the Browns coaching staff adjusted after week 3. They realized that they were putting Baker in bad spots. Baker was not helping. He was very much a big part of the problem as well, but they adjusted. They changed their personnel. Warren Sharp was noting that on Twitter, how they were running more 2 tight end sets than they were the previous week, where they were mostly in 3 receiver sets the week before that. They changed up their personnel. They lowered Baker's time to throw by a half second on average from his full season number. They made adjustments. And if Michigan can make adjustments to help Shea Patterson, I think that we could see a continuation of what we saw against Rutgers. It's not going to be that Rutgers game, but it can get better.
No, I mean, that's exactly what they did. I mean, they really simplified the game for Shea against Rutgers. Some rollouts, some quicker decisions, just simplified everything. Yeah. And I think, it's been interesting because a lot of the talk around here and on my radio show this morning was well, they just can't do this for the rest of the season. And part of my argument was well, Mike Leach has been making his offense simple forever, right? And I think sometimes we don't put enough emphasis on the execution aspect of football. And especially when you're Michigan and you just have 3 NFL caliber wide receivers, why not make it simple? Right. Just beat the guy,
Right. Put the ball in their hands and let their talent shine.
Yeah, exactly. And
so I think,
it's going to get tough against Iowa. Yeah. But yeah, we'll see. I mean, it'll be interesting to see what Baker Mayfield does on this Monday night game. So looking forward to it.
Hoping that Jarvis Landry is healthy, because he seemed to be a pretty big key for that strategy of get it out quick last week. And he is currently concussion protocol, so having or losing him might be a big loss, especially if Rashard Higgins can't go. But broadly, I believe in Baker. Let's move on to my covering the future here. Actually talking about a game we discussed with JJ, and I also want to back up what JJ was saying, and I want the under for the Colts and the Chiefs. This game opened at 57, and it has already gone down to 56, despite 78% of the money being on the over. So we could see this total back up, and I don't think it'll go down too much more. So you might be able to hold off here and see if you can get a better number on Sunday, but I like the under regardless. I think it's probably like 3-ish points too high, because think about this anecdotally. If you are the Colts, what do you want to do? You want to run the ball this week to as much as possible, because you want to lower this sample when you're an 11-point dog, and you want to keep Patrick Mahomes on the sidelines. And the Colts have seemed pretty obliged to do that, and they've been pretty good as a rushing offense so far this year. They rank second in schedule-adjusted rushing offense based on number fires metrics. The Chiefs are 24th against the rush, and they want you to run the ball on them because it prevents you from passing. And Ed, this is something you've discussed before, and I'll talk to you about this after we're done here, but it's a smart strategy, as you've discussed. You want teams to run against you because it means they are not throwing. But the Colts, in their 2 road games this year, when they weren't on turf, which is a big difference for this team, they were super run heavy. They threw 57% of the time on first and second down in the first halves of games the first 2 weeks. They ranked 19th in pass rate in those situations, so a lot more run heavy than they were last year with Andrew Luck. Marlon Mack did miss practice on Wednesday, and T.Y. Hilton didn't practice. Paris Campbell didn't practice. And if Mack can't play, then they may skew more towards the pass. But his injury on Sunday didn't seem too serious, and Hilton, I don't know if he's going to play, but Hilton was healthy in weeks 1 and 2, and they still skewed toward the run. So I think that's why they're just going to be run heavy when they're not indoors this year. It sounds like they believe in their offensive line. They believe in Marlon Mack, and they might not believe as much in Jacoby Brissett in this passing offense when they're outdoors. The Chiefs defense also does play better when they're at home, because Arrowhead is a very hostile environment, as Lamar Jackson showed a couple weeks ago. So I think the under is very much the play here. I'm not sure if the Chiefs will cover, because I think, again, this game should be a lower scoring, which makes it harder to cover an 11-point spread. But I think that under on 56 makes a lot of sense, just because if you're thinking about this like Frank Reich, you want to lower that sample, you want to increase the variance, and the way you do that is by keeping the clock going and running the football. So I think that's the way I would skew here, Ed. But I want to talk to you, because I've seen you talk about this before, where teams may incentivize their opponents to run because they know it's less efficient. And I find that mindset genius, first of all, but it's also super interesting. So what did you find when you were looking back at this?
Well, I mean, we know that throwing the ball is more efficient than running the ball in general. And you find these interesting cases where Bill Belichick, talked to his New York Giants defense when he was the coordinator there for the Super Bowl, I think in &92. And he basically told him to let Thurman Thomas rush for 100 yards, which, when I first read that, I was like, what? But when you start thinking about it in terms of the efficiencies, Belichick understands analytics kind of instinctively, I think. And
I think he uses them. I think he's trying to play coy when he says he doesn't use them.
Yeah, well, he stopped going for it a lot on fourth down. So,
Okay. Maybe not.
We'll see. We'll see exactly. But in terms of just, running a 2-3-5 or a 2-3-6 or whatever kind of defense to let teams run, but really hopefully shut down their pass attack. That's probably a positive expected value type strategy. Yeah. I'm actually looking at some of my notes for the Colts right now, and it's kind of interesting because I predict them to get their rush offense has been great. I predict them to get 5.2 yards per carry against an average rush defense, and that's actually a little bit better than the 4.8 yards per pass attempt. But that's because they have such a good rush offense behind that offensive line, and Jacoby Brissett might not be as good as his touchdown rate suggests. So it's always going to be team dependent. Obviously if you flip those numbers, or even the average kind of NFL team is going to be more efficient throwing the ball than they are running it. That's just kind of the truth. So Yeah. So anyways, that's the analysis.
So last year, the worst team against the rush on a per attempt basis based on number fires metrics was Kansas City. Like, I think this is the route they're taking. We've also seen this with Wade Phillips all the time. You know, he's always been someone who has allowed teams to run against him. The Rams were 10th worst against the rush last year. They were a great team. And I think that that's part of it. Like, it seems like it is intentional because it's so consistent with Wade Phillips' defense, where he consistently doesn't grade out very well against the rush. His defenses don't. Andy Reid is the same thing, and they're both very smart coaches. So I think there's a lot to that. I think that Frank Reich is smart enough to know that they're trying to bait him into running, but I still think they'll do it because that's what they've done when they've been on the road so far this year.
And that might actually be the best strategy with their personnel. I was just pulling up my numbers on Kansas City. So last year was very interesting because they were basically worse than the NFL at run defense and middle of the pack in pass defense. Which, you know, if you're going to suck, that's the way you want to suck.
Right.
You don't want to
Absolutely.
flip. And it's pretty much the exact same thing. I mean, I have them at 32nd in adjusted rush success rate on defense, 18th on for passing. So it's not. That's what they do, you know. And it'd be interesting. Like, we didn't see them make a lot of moves to upgrade their situation at cornerback. During the offseason. So, you know, if they had kind of done that, it would more support kind of that strategy. Sure. But, you know, the numbers look very similar from last year to this year.
Yeah, they did get Frank Clark, defensive end, and Tyrann Mathieu at safety to try to help.
Yeah.
And those are both those are both pass defense moves. So you always ask on your podcast, on the Football Analytics Show, if you could have lunch with someone or dinner with someone. I think Andy Reid would be a really fascinating guy to talk to.
Yeah.
Talk a little football.
I think so, for sure.
He had a macaroni and cheese recipe that came out at one point. So you could have some good talk with Andy Reid. And I'd be inclined to talk some football with him. I think it'd be fun.
Yeah, absolutely. And to figure out like what happened at the end of his Philly tenure.
Yes, that I think, you as a former Eagles fan too, I'm sure that would especially interest you as well. That is all we have for this week. Before we close up shop though, Ed, anything big going on over at the Power Rank for the rest of this week?
Yeah, I mean, you know, the free email newsletter, you get a sample of my best predictions and some analysis. So members actually have access to all the success rate adjusted for strength of schedule numbers that I've been talking about for the NFL. I think, like, especially the next couple weeks, it's kind of an invaluable tool to figure out how to get off your preseason priors, and start doing some analysis. So yeah, that's available for members of my site. You can check it out at thepowerrank.net.
You can find Ed's podcast, The Football Analytics Show, wherever you get podcasts. And I think that it is important to look at those numbers to kind of know where we may need to reevaluate teams now that we have seen them with their current personnel groupings. If you have any questions for me, I am on Twitter at Jim Sannes, JimSannes. You can also follow the FanDuel Podcast Network at FanDuel Podcasts. Ed is on Twitter at The Power Rank. Big thank you to Calvin Theobald for producing for today, as always, and chopping up the videos for the @FanDuel Twitter account. Thank you, Cal, for that. And a thank you to those of you who tuned in for today. Thank you to JJ Zachariason and Eli Hershkovich, our two guests for this week, talking college football and NFL to get you set for this weekend. I hope that all of your bets go well for Week 6 of college football and Week 5 in the NFL. Back at you next week to talk more football. This has been Covering the Spread right here on the FanDuel Podcast Network.